right. Hey, welcome everybody. My name is Sopal Ear. I'm a board member of the Center for Khmer Studies. Also an associate professor at the Thunderbird School of Global Management at Arizona State University. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this special webinar hosted by the Center for Khmer Studies. I'm honored to moderate this conversation with our U.S. Dissertation Research Fellow, Taylor Copeland, whose work offers a fresh and compelling window into Cold War geopolitics, post-colonial development, and the strategic role of infrastructure in Cambodia. And if you know anything about infrastructure, you know that this has been a recurring refrain, right? Right now, or in the recent past, it's been all about infrastructure once again, with the Belt and Road Initiative, thanks to China. And so, it's like an echo of the past in some sense. Taylor is a PhD candidate in the Department of the History of Science at Harvard University. His dissertation titled Building Between the Blocs, Technology and Non-Alignment in Cold War Cambodia explores how Cold War rivalries materialize not just through ideology or military strategy, but through the concrete, literally means of national development, highways, hydroelectric dams, and factories. Drawing on archival research in Cambodia, the United States, and Australia, Taylor traces how Cambodia's non-aligned diplomacy under Prince Norodom Sihanouk enabled it to navigate offers of aid from both sides of the Iron Curtain, turning geopolitics into infrastructure and infrastructure into sovereignty. Today's presentation brings together the history of science and technology, Southeast Asian post-colonial state building, and Cold War diplomacy in a way that is analytically rigorous, deeply researched, and highly relevant to how we think about development, dependency, and national agency. Taylor will present for roughly 45, maybe 50 minutes, at which point we'll open the floor for discussion after I've posed some questions first. And I encourage everyone to post questions in the Q&A feature of Zoom, and to then have these questions sent over to me so that I can use them for the purposes of posing them to Taylor. This is meant to be collaborative and open in terms of conversation, so please don't hold back. With that, Taylor, the screen is yours.
Good morning, everyone who is joining us from Cambodia. Good afternoon, good evening to people joining from other locations. And thank you all very much for being here. My name is Taylor Copeland, and I'm a PhD candidate at Harvard in the History of Science department. The talk I'll give today draws from my dissertation. I try to provide the full arc of my argument today in 45 minutes. The title is Building Between the Blocs, Technology and Non-Alignment in Cold War Cambodia. At its core, my project examines how Cambodia navigated rivalries of the Cold War, not just through diplomacy, but through the very concrete and steel of national infrastructure. I focus specifically on highways, factories, hydroelectric dams, each of which are paradoxically built with foreign aid, but meant to serve Cambodian sovereignty. Before I begin the actual talk, I would really like to take a moment to sincerely thank the Center for Khmer Studies for supporting this research, without which it would have been completely impossible. Their funding allowed me to spend a significant and lovely amount of time in Cambodia, allowed me to visit both the project sites and the National Archives of Cambodia. I would also like to thank Dr. Sopal Ear for moderating this session and for his generous engagement with my work. I'm very much looking forward to our discussion after my presentation. And just a note for everyone in the audience, this is actually the first time that I'm presenting the full arc of my dissertation, so I'm very open to any questions or feedback, constructive or otherwise, to help me improve on the work. So again, thank you all so much for joining today. So I'm going to start with a brief bit of historical context. Typically, when I present parts of this to history of science communities, I have to spend a lot more time on the Cambodian historical context aspect, but I'm excited to be here with like-minded scholars, and I'll keep this brief to make sure that we're all on the same page. Cambodia gained full independence from France in 1953 through what Prince Norodom Sihanouk called his Royal Crusade. Unlike Vietnam, independence did not come through war, but through diplomacy and international pressure on France. But independence did not erase dependency. Cambodia was small, rural, and precariously positioned. For centuries, its two larger neighbors, Thailand and Vietnam, had threatened its territorial integrity. An infrastructure left behind by the French tied Cambodia's economy firmly into French Indochina. The early years of independence were therefore dominated by two interlocking priorities: preserving sovereignty amid Cold War rivalries, and building infrastructure of a modern nation, new ports, new highways, new factories, and reliable electricity. These projects were intended to cut against the grain of colonial geography and reorient Cambodia's economy towards sovereignty. And here lies the paradox. The very infrastructure that was supposed to guarantee autonomy was financed and built by Cold War powers, each seeking to enroll Cambodia into their own spheres of influence. My talk today will focus on how Cambodian political leaders, Prince Norodom Sihanouk, but also ministers specifically of the Ministry of Public Works and the Ministry of Planning, navigated this complex and difficult paradox. So I'd like to start with these three photos, which I think are uniquely and intrinsically intriguing and really kind of capture the heart of my work. You see here Cambodian technicians at work alongside American engineers on the Khmer-American Friendship Highway, alongside Yugoslavian specialists at the Kuriram Dam, and alongside Chinese advisors in a plywood factory. Most studies of non-alignment emphasize the ideological or economic governance, abstract efforts to find a third way between communism and capitalism. My focus here is different. I look at the materiality of Cambodian non-alignment. What it meant in practice was that Cambodian leaders and technicians sought to amalgamate the technological products of competing socio-political systems into a coherent network of national infrastructure. Highways built with American machines, dams financed with Yugoslavian loans, factories equipped with Chinese looms were all stitched together into Cambodia's first national infrastructure. Non-alignment in this sense was more than diplomatic rhetoric. It was built piece by piece in concrete and steel with the everyday labor of Cambodian technicians. So here's a quick roadmap of today's talk, just to give us a bit of structure to expect. I'll start out by just laying out my historiographical intervention, where I'm hoping to add something to the history of both Cambodia, the Cold War, and infrastructure. And my central argument, which is that Cambodian non-alignment was not only ideological, but was built materially through these aspects of infrastructure. Then I'll turn to my three case studies, the first of which is the Khmer-American Friendship Highway, which we now all know as National Highway 4. If anyone had taken a trip from Phnom Penh to Sihanoukville before the new expressway, you've experienced this road for better or worse. These projects reoriented Cambodia's geography of trade and made independence possible, but also revealed the vulnerabilities of a dependent construction. The second case is Chinese-funded factories, textile, plywood, paper, and cement, which I interpret as workshops of non-alignment, where Cambodian planners tried to integrate different technical systems into their own distinct vision of development. And my third case study is hydroelectric dams, which showed how Prince Sihanouk leveraged aid from Yugoslavia, the Soviet Union, and the United States simultaneously to power industrialization while balancing Cold War pressures. I'll close by reflecting on contemporary path dependencies of this project and how decisions made in the 50s and 60s, in my opinion, continue to shape Cambodian infrastructure and politics today. Lastly, I'll open up for questions and hopefully a lively discussion with participants. So when situating the project in the literature, there are three main bodies of scholarship I seek to address. The first is the history of Cambodia itself. Most scholarship here focuses either on the French colonial period or on the Khmer Rouge period, but the 𝐀𝐛𝐬𝐭𝐫𝐚𝐜 period, which was the Sihanouk government from 1953 to 1970, receives much less attention. And I argue that this is a big gap in the literature that I seek to try to fill here. Despite the disruption of civil war, foreign occupation, and revolution between 1970 and 1993, I argue that there is a striking continuity and path dependency between infrastructure built in the 𝐀𝐻𝐭 period and contemporary Cambodian infrastructure built in the last 3 decades. Secondly, the literature on non-alignment, which is a growing field, especially in recent years with the opening of new archives. However, Cambodia remains very marginalized in this history, despite the central role that it played both in the Bandung Conference of 1955 and in the 1961 non-aligned conference in Belgrade. My work seeks to bring Cambodia firmly back into the story of non-alignment by showing how it practiced neutrality through infrastructure. And third, the field of history of science, my own field, and science and technology studies have developed significant literature on the technopolitics during the Cold War, focusing specifically on competing capitalist and communist models of development. However, very little attention has been paid to the materiality of non-alignment. Not just the attempt to reconcile political or economic theories, but the effort to integrate the actual technological artifacts that these competing systems were producing. There is one notable exception to this, which is David Ingerman's Price of Aid, in which he argues that Indian officials engaged with competing offers of technical aid to pursue domestic political goals and outmaneuver domestic political rivals. My focus on Cambodia, however, is different. I look not at Cambodia's own domestic political struggles, but how Cambodian leaders sought to amalgamate competing technological projects in order to extract the country from colonial networks and maintain sovereignty between its two larger neighbors. In terms of methodology, my research primarily draws on three main archival bases. The first is the US records from the National Archives and Record Administration. These contain correspondence between the International Cooperation Administration, which is the precursor to USAID, and also correspondences between the US Overseas Mission in Phnom Penh, which managed most of these projects. My second resource is the National Archives of Australia, which preserve detailed reports from Australian engineers and officials involved in Mekong development projects. And these records are especially important because from 1965 to 1970, US and Cambodia had no diplomatic relations due to diplomatic breakdowns, which I'll discuss. And as a result, I found that the Australian embassy actually offered an unofficial intermediary between the two governments. So their records offer a lot of insight here that I don't think has been effectively explored by historians. And lastly, and in some ways most importantly, the National Archives of Phnom Penh themselves have provided a lot of insight into Cambodian ministerial correspondences, project evaluations, and press coverage. In addition to this archival research, I conducted site visits to many of the infrastructure projects I discussed today, traveling to Kirirom, to Kam Chai, to Prek Ngao, and the highway corridor to Sihanoukville. Seeing the physical remnants of these projects was invaluable as it helped me connect the paper records to material legacies still visible and still formative in Cambodia's landscape. In terms of theory, my analysis relies on the concept of technopolitics. Technopolitics captures how hybrid forms of power are embedded in technological systems. It shows how technologies are built to achieve political goals, and in my opinion, more interestingly, how failure can undermine these political goals, how technical failure can undermine political goals. In Cambodia, these infrastructures were sites of contestation. Donor nations sought to inscribe their own political models of development into the very design of these projects. American-built highway, for example, had an open contracting procedure and a reliance on private firms, which was meant to showcase the superiority of the capitalist model of development. Chinese factories, by contrast, included residential housing, schools, theaters, even swimming pools for workers, which echoed the Maoist model of the socialist work unit, the idea that your position within your work unit should be constitutive to your community, to your life. But Cambodian actors did not simply absorb these imported technologies. Within the Ministry of Public Works and Ministry of Planning, officials pushed back, adapted projects to meet Cambodian visions of independence and non-alignment. In this way, foreign aid projects became areas where Cambodia both accepted and reshaped political blueprints embedded in technical systems. My central concept for this project is what I call engineering non-alignment. In Cambodia, national infrastructure was not simply imported, it was developed through a process in which foreign aid projects were treated as technical modules to be trialed, translated, and integrated into a coherent national system. This was engineering in two senses. Literally, it meant building dams, roads, bridges, and factories, but it also meant engineering at an institutional level, designing procurement rules, oversight routines, training programs, and distribution mechanisms that made these imported templates function within the Cambodian political economy. In short, engineering non-alignment was the practice of reshaping foreign aid into sovereign infrastructure. Before we dive into the case studies, I would like to make just one note about national infrastructure. By national infrastructure, I mean the material systems whose construction and governance were necessary for Cambodia to exercise sovereignty after independence. So my definition is both functional and geographic. Functionally, these systems reduced reliance on colonial or foreign intermediaries in transport, energy, industrial production. Geographically, they reoriented inherited Indo-Chinese networks towards a Cambodian territorial economy, providing direct access to external markets. Thus, as we'll see, the Khmer-American Friendship Highway to Sihanoukville provided the country's first and only direct access to global trade. The wave of Chinese-built factories aimed to move production beyond colonial resource extraction into valued-added industry. And while projects in education and health mattered significantly for capacity, they lie outside of my analytical scope here, which really focuses on transport corridors, power generation, and core industry as the backbone of the sovereign political economy. So let's start with my first case study. Here we have one of my favorite photos from the archives with a group of individuals riding on elephants down the new graded Khmer-American Friendship Highway, now known as National Highway 4. Built along French-constructed port of Sihanoukville, this was the single largest American aid project in Cambodia. It was designed to connect the capital to the sea, giving Cambodia direct access to global markets and sovereign control over imports and exports. In short, it was intended to provide infrastructure of independence, a road that would allow Cambodia, in Prince Sihanouk's words, to breathe through its own nose. This is an important phrase that I'll come back to when I talk more about contemporary path dependency. So the project was immediately central to Cambodian independence. Literally a month after the Geneva Conference in 1954 that codified Cambodia's independence, Sihanouk's government sent identical letters to both France and the United States requesting aid for a deepwater port and a connecting highway. For Cambodian leaders, this was an urgent matter of sovereignty. Without direct access to the sea, Cambodia trade remained hostage to its neighbors. Both South Vietnam and Thailand had, within living memory, imposed blockades or restrictions on Cambodian exports. Only by securing its own road could the country guarantee the independence it had just won. The urgency was rooted in a legacy of colonial infrastructure. Under the French protectorate, the logic of roads and waterways ran not towards Cambodia's coast, but towards Saigon and the Mekong Delta. In the 1930s, Phnom Penh was more closely tied to Cochin than to Kampot or Takao in its own territory. National Highway 1 led directly into Vietnam, and the Mekong itself carried rice, fish, and rubber downstream to Saigon. Even though one road to the Cambodian coast, National Highway 3, ended at Kampot, a shallow harbor suitable only for fishing boats at the time. Independence in this sense revealed a harsh truth. Cambodia was still economically landlocked by colonial design. The vulnerability of this position was dramatized almost immediately. In 1956, after Sihanouk's high-profile visit to Beijing, South Vietnam retaliated by closing its border to Cambodian goods. Phnom Penh suddenly realized that the Mekong could be shut at any moment. Trade could stop overnight, leaving Cambodia with no outlet to world markets. It was in this context that Sihanouk coined the pithy phrase, "The new port and highway would allow Cambodia to breathe through its own nose." The metaphor captured the project's stakes. It was not just about moving goods, but about developing the essential infrastructure for genuine independence. The solution for Sihanouk and his ministers was to build new national infrastructure. France agreed to construct the deepwater port at Sihanoukville. The United States agreed to finance and build the connecting highway. But the project carried very different meanings for each party. For Cambodia, it was a lifeline to independence. For France, it was an opportunity to maintain influence in a colony it had been forced to relinquish. And for Washington, at first, the project seemed to be a gradual way to supplant French leadership in Cambodia. Only later, once Chinese and Soviet aid began to arrive in Phnom Penh, did American officials begin to speak of the road as a yardstick, a measure of US technological ability, and a test of whether American aid could outpace the appeal of communism in newly independent Asia. Even in its earliest planning stages, the project was shaped by Cold War logic. There was debate over which route the highway should take. Cambodian and American planners favored extending the old colonial road through Kampot along the coast. But American military advisors firmly opposed this. They warned that if South Vietnam fell to communism, which according to the Americans in 1955 seemed very likely, then a coastal road would be dangerously exposed to bombardment from the sea, especially from Phu Quoc Island. In Washington Gables, the highway was explicitly framed as essential to preventing the next domino in Southeast Asia from tipping. To disguise the military rationale, officials justified the inland route through Kampong Speu as the way of stimulating economic development in what they perceived to be an underdeveloped region of Cambodia. The final decision reflected those strategic anxieties, even as it was presented as economic planning. But it also carried enormous technical implications. Instead of upgrading an existing and well-traveled road, engineers would have to cut an entirely new highway through Kampong Speu, a province of dense jungle, heavy rainfall, and very little pre-existing infrastructure. The choice was justified in the language of development and sovereignty, but the reality was a costly and technically daunting construction product that would test the capacity, both mentally and physically, of all involved. Construction for the Khmer American Highway began in late 1956 under the construction company A.L. Doherty Overseas, or ALDO, as I'll refer to them for the rest of the talk. This was a small road building company from Indiana with almost no overseas experience. The contracting process itself reflected the complexities of Cold War aid. Officially, the contract was signed with Cambodia's Ministry of Public Works. However, in practice, all approvals ran through the International Cooperation Administration, or ICA, as I mentioned, the forerunner to the contemporary or previous USAID, with American engineers providing oversight and American bureaucrats managing every aspect of the project. This arrangement was not only cumbersome, it was ideological. US officials wanted the project to demonstrate the superiority of the capitalist mode of development, showing how private firms could be effectively supervised, and at the same time training the Cambodian ministry in the management of these private firms. From the very beginning, the project was trouble. Aldo shipped over $1 million worth of used machinery from its lots in Chicago and Albany. However, much of it was already worn down, and by the time it reached Kampong Som, now known as Sihanouk, after weeks at sea, many machines were inoperable. Crews were required to cannibalize some of the units for spare parts just to begin cutting the first few accessed roads. By early 1957, morale was already dangerously low. Cambodian officials voiced complaints that Aldo ignored labor laws, failed to compensate workers who were injured. For the ministry, this was not just a labor dispute. It risked fomenting critics who claimed that American firms were operating with impunity in Cambodia. The greatest technical problem, however, was geological. Along the inland route through Kampong Speu, there was no gravel quarries and no reliable sources of crushed stone for the roadbed. The Americans had assumed, arrogantly perhaps, that they could build with the exact standard aggregates found in Middle America. However, when they reached the actual site itself, they found nothing but dense tropical soils. The solution they turned to was a mineral called laterite, which is an iron-rich red clay, very familiar in Cambodia. In rural roads, if you hear the term plo de krahom, the red dirt of these rural roads is red because of laterite. So this is also a mineral, just as a side note, that's used in the foundation of Angkor Wat itself. So laterite was well known to Cambodian technicians, but they also knew its limitations. And Plek Chat, who was the Minister of Public Works at the time, strongly cautioned American officials against using this material as the base for a highway because it had never been tested on anything larger than small rural roads. By mid-1957, frustrations with the highway project reached Washington itself. Congressman Porter Hardy's International Operations Subcommittee launched hearings into U.S. aid programs specifically signaling out this highway project as the main target of its investigation for all American overseas aid. November 1957, the congressional delegation actually traveled to Phnom Penh. They reviewed Aldo's records and quickly discovered what many in Cambodia already knew, that the ICA had delegated procurement to Aldo, which had in effect sold its own used equipment back to the US government, many of which was entirely inoperable by the time it reached Cambodia. Testimony during the hearing only deepened this embarrassment. Former Aldo staff described harsh conditions, poor management, and broken morale. Workers reported Cambodian laborers injured without compensation. And in Washington, these accounts painted a picture of mismanagement and exploitation, with one official record noting that all those procurement procedures and worker treatment was highly unethical, if not illegal. And yet, despite these revelations, there were no punitive measures. The project had already become so important as a symbol of American aid to Cambodia that congressional members insisted it be completed at any cost. If it failed, it would be a propaganda victory to the communist bloc, and therefore they insisted on doubling down to ensure that the project was completed. Despite the delays and disputes and also congressional scrutiny, construction continued to accelerate with the liberal use of laterite throughout the project. As the French continued to push ahead with their project on the port, the Americans had more pressure to ensure that the highway was completed at the same time. So by May 1959, the road was quietly open to traffic, and in July, a grand inauguration took place. The ceremony was staged as a spectacle of friendship. At both ends of the roads, monuments designed by the young architect Van Molevan were unveiled, and there was actually a ballet developed by the Royal Cambodian Ballet titled the 𝐀𝐻𝐭 Friendship Highway. For the press, it was a triumph in that moment. Newspapers hailed the project as the largest single American aid venture in Cambodia. There were over 400 Cambodian personnel trained, and the ultimate cost of the highway was 32 million US dollars, which was more than double the initial estimates. It was for that moment a monument to friendship between the two countries and newfound independence for Cambodia. This, however, was a short-lived triumph. Within weeks of inauguration, cracks in the highway began to show, quite literally. The 1959 rainy season brought floods that undermined embankments, landslides made sections completely impassable, and US engineers warned that the situation was critical and extremely serious. The Cambodian Ministry of Public Works, however, had very limited capacity to respond. The machinery that was turned over to them at the ceremony was at this point almost entirely unusable, and the mechanics who had been given only abbreviated training struggled to keep them working at all. At first, American officials adamantly blamed Cambodian neglect. They suggested that this was a failure of maintenance, not of construction. However, in 1960, an independent survey revealed that the problems were actually structural. The road had been built on a thin laterite base, vulnerable to disintegration with the rain. Drainage systems were incomplete or underbuilt, and the slopes in the mountains were unstable. In short, the failures were not a result of poor maintenance, but of decisions made during the actual construction process. In 1961, responsibility for repairs were quietly shifted to the US Bureau of Public Roads. What had begun as a showcase of private sector efficiency and market-led development now required a statist rescue. The very model that the highway meant to exemplify had been inverted. By 1962, the Bureau of Public Roads confirmed what earlier surveys had already suggested. Laterite was the fundamental cause of decomposition in the road. A new company was brought in to try to begin these repairs, but again, delays due to weather and due to insufficient gravel resources slowed things down. And this contributed to an event in 1963 where suddenly Prince Sihanouk abruptly terminated all US aid to Cambodia. It's important to remember that this break of relations was very complex and had multiple causes, from Sihanouk's neutralist diplomacy to American frustrations over his dealings with Beijing, the assassination of 𝐀𝐻𝐭 in Vietnam, and also radio broadcasts that Sihanouk constantly thought were being funded by Americans. However, I want to argue here that the actual technical failure of this highway and the friction that it caused between American and Cambodian officials was also contributing to this breakdown in relations. So by 1963, you have a partially built, partially deteriorating road with no more ability for American technicians to work on it. So in my opinion, the 𝐀𝐻𝐭 Friendship Highway reveals this sort of paradox of Cold War infrastructure. For Cambodian leaders, it was a gamble to secure sovereignty and really fundamentally rewire Cambodian geography itself. But the very materiality of the project undermined these ambitions. The lateritic base and broken machinery, insufficient drainage, all revealed structural weaknesses in the American aid system. When the road cracked, so did the political scaffolding of the bilateral relationship. The US insistence on direct administration of the highway project left Cambodian leaders with little room to exert agency. As a result, the responsibility for the road's failure fell entirely on the United States. The direct administration of this project stands in stark contrast to my next case study of Chinese manufacturing aid, where authority over planning and administration was left primarily to Cambodian state officials. My second case study focuses on factories built with Chinese aid in the late 50s and early 60s. To my knowledge, nothing has currently been published in the literature on these projects at all, which is striking considering the dominant role that Cambodia plays today in Cambodian manufacturing. These factories included a textile mill in Kampong Cham, a plywood factory in Day Et near Phnom Penh, a paper mill in Chlong in Krati province, and a massive cement factory in Chankre Ting right outside of Kampot. Together, they were the centerpiece of Cambodia's first Chinese aid agreement, which was signed in 1956. While their material output was often modest, these factories functioned, in my argument, as workshops of non-alignment, producing visions of Cambodian sovereignty and development that extended far beyond their shop floors. These factories were not simply gifts, nor were they turnkey wholesale transfers of Maoist industrialization. They were experimental spaces where Cambodian planners trialed combinations of foreign technical assistance and local priorities. Unlike US aid, which relied on direct US administration, Chinese assistance came with no field headquarters and few conditions. This no strings attached model projected respect for Cambodian sovereignty and allowed Cambodian planners to shape the projects to their own ends. This very flexibility made them politically valuable. When outputs faltered, responsibility was shared between Cambodian ministries rather than resting entirely on Chinese technicians and Chinese aid. So again, a quick bit of historical context. Chinese industrial aid was shaped by the Chinese experience of the Great Leap Forward. Domestically, the campaign was faltering, but abroad, it still symbolized the possibility of rapid industrialization through collective labor and indigenous resources. However, for leaders like Sihanouk, China's colonial past and its struggle for sovereignty, more than its experiments with Maoism and rapid collective industrialization, made it a relatable model, more so than either the Soviet Union or the United States. Chinese aid emphasized light industry, self-reliance, and anti-imperialist solidarity. This was attractive to Cambodian leaders not because they sought communism, but because it offered a compressed timeline of development, something achievable and pragmatic, rather than abstract and ideological. The relationship between Cambodia and China began at the Bandung Conference in Indonesia in 1955, where Prince Sihanouk met with Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai and established the foundations of China's relationship with Cambodia. In 1956, the following year, the Sino-Cambodian aid agreement followed, valued at over $22 million US, and this was, very importantly, China's first aid package ever to a non-communist country. Crucially, it was offered as a grant, not a loan, and Chinese officials stressed that it was given, again, without strings attached, which for Cambodian leaders was an ideal ideological match. The factories also revealed the unique structure of Chinese assistance. Funds were funneled directly to the Cambodia's Ministry of Planning, not through a Chinese mission office, which stood in stark contrast to US and Soviet projects. In Cambodia, the Sino-Khmer Commission coordinated technical matters, but Cambodian officials retained control over budgeting, staffing, and the pace of projects. In addition, the Office of State Enterprises was created to manage and distribute products of these factories. Similar to the American attempt to demonstrate capitalist development through private contracting, the Office of State Enterprises introduced the tools of centralized economic state planning, ensuring that Cambodian leaders directed the integration of Chinese aid into a sovereign economic framework. So I'm very excited for these case studies. Actually, I have some videos to share to help bring these spaces to life. The Kampong Cham textile factory quickly became the most strategically favored of the 4 Chinese-funded projects. Cambodian planners do not treat it as a radical rupture, but a logical extension of what already existed. Cambodian leaders explicitly linked these projects to French-era weaving and spinning schools, framing it as part of a broader import substitution strategy for garments. In that sense, the factory is less of a Maoist gift of revolution, but an effort to build upon institutions already in place in Cambodia. Construction began in 1959, and the following year, the site employed more than 1,500 Cambodian workers in excavation and assembly. The official inauguration took place on May 1960 and was carefully staged during Zhou Enlai's state visit to Cambodia. The factory itself embodied a process of hybridization. French and Chinese inputs overlapped rather than competed. On the shop floor, machinery imported from Shanghai stood alongside technicians who were trained in Japan and also in France. Cambodia officials also approved a parallel French-backed textile venture, convinced that the domestic market could absorb both simultaneously. In addition, the textile sector became a laboratory of non-alignment, where foreign projects were layered and recombined to suit Cambodian priorities. The products of the factory, cotton yarn, bleached and unbleached cloth, and essentially mosquito netting, were distributed through the Office of State Enterprises, tying the mill directly into the state's planning apparatus. The integration to national economic structures was as important as its technical output. It was celebrated in the press, repeatedly invoked in Sihanouk's speeches, and held up as evidence that Cambodia can modernize on its own terms by blending Chinese capital, French training, and Japanese expertise, all under Cambodian ministerial oversight into a single coherent project. The next example is the Day Et plywood factory. Just south of Phnom Penh, the plywood factory stood as a facade of modernity. Its wide frontage was landscaped with neat gardens, and Sihanouk promised that the adjacent workers' city would soon follow, complete with a school, canteen, infirmary, theater, and even swimming pool. In his speech in the opening, Sihanouk cast this vision not as socialist collectivism, but as a paternalist extension of the Sankum governance, an expression of royal benevolence rather than class struggle. Production began in 1960 with a projected target of almost 1 million square meters of plywood per year. Yet technical challenges immediately surfaced. International observers, including the French commercial attaché, dismissed Cambodian plywood as both costly and inferior in quality. Strikingly, a shipment of plywood bound for China was rejected immediately, showing that the factory could not even meet the standards of its donor country. Still, the site became an important workshop of non-alignment. By 1960, nearly 90 Cambodian technicians trained in China were returned and assigned to take over from Chinese specialists as they quietly withdrew. This handover was publicized as proof of Cambodia's growing self-reliance. And at the same time, the government banned plywood imports, ensuring that the domestic market was channeled into the factory's output. Commercial performance was weak, but symbolic value remained high. The plywood sheets, stamped with state-defined classifications and marketed under the banner of friendship, carried the weight of sovereignty even when they failed to carry the weight of the buildings they constructed. The factory demonstrated how Chinese aid can be domesticated, redeployed, and domestically integrated into Cambodia's planning apparatus. Unfortunately, I don't have a video for Chlong due to its remoteness. The factory in Chlong in Krati province, though, marked a very different kind of experiment. Unlike the textile or plywood factories, which drew on imported cotton and industrial hardwoods, Chlong was designed to industrialize Cambodia on its own rural materials. Rice straw, bamboo, and firewood were the only inputs required for this factory. In this sense, it was modeled quite consciously on Maoist rural paper mills, which used the same low-value materials as symbols of resilience, independence, and revolutionary resolve. The promise was striking. 5,000 tons of newsprint, cardboard, and wrapping paper per year, all drawn from the waste products of the Cambodian countryside. In practice, however, these results fell short. In its first year of operation, Chlong produced only about 1,600 tons, less than a third of its capacity. Still, like the other factories, it carried significant symbolic weight. It linked rural agriculture and labor in rural areas to national production, and extended this model of industrialization under Sihanouk's leadership far beyond Phnom Penh into the rural areas of the country where political leadership was less solid and much more tenuous. So even in its failure, the Chlong factory reinforced a powerful narrative that Cambodia could attempt to industrialize on its own terms without relying on the import of even reagents from foreign countries. Lastly, the cement factory at 𝐀𝐛𝐬𝐭 near Kampot was by far the most ambitious of Cambodia's projects with Chinese aid. From the very beginning, Cambodian officials insisted on its construction, even when Chinese specialists suggested that it would be cheaper and more efficient to simply import cement from North Vietnam or from China. For Cambodian planners, domestic production of cement was not a matter of efficiency, but of sovereignty. Cement was the material of modern statehood, essential for schools, hospitals, and public buildings, and it had to be produced under Cambodian control. Built on a massive scale, 𝐀𝐿 was conceived more than a single plant. As you can see in the video, it was an industrial city in miniature, including spare parts factories, a foundry, workers' housing, guest facilities, and even a football field. More than 2,000 Cambodian workers, including 1,000 conscripts, labored on the site in 3 shifts, nearly all of it done manually with minimal mechanization, a striking display of Maoist labor-intensive self-reliance rendered here on Cambodian soil. However, what emerged when the project was complete was not a simple transplant of Maoist industrialism, but a non-linear amalgamation. When labor unrest broke out in 1961, workers complaining of poor conditions and alienation from project leadership that was largely managed by Chinese engineers, the Cambodian government intervened. They appointed a nationalist administrator, 𝐀𝐻 Soran, who introduced what he called, ironically, American-style management techniques, which included suggestion boxes, group meetings, and feedback sessions. Within 2 weeks, tensions eased. In effect, Maoist mass labor was being stabilized by US industrial psychology, producing in Cambodia this hybrid model of governance as well as production. The cement itself became a perfect symbol of Cambodia's infrastructural non-alignment. The cement was used to construct American-funded schools, French upgraded roads, and Soviet-built hospitals. It was hauled to Phnom Penh, ironically, along the American-constructed highway, moving from Chinese-financed kilns to rival bloc infrastructure. In a sense, 𝐀𝐿 was the clearest expression of Sihanouk's non-aligned vision. It fused monumental symbolism of Chinese heavy industry with the infrastructural legacies of rival powers, creating a distinctly Cambodian system. More than any other project, 𝐀𝐿 demonstrates how Cambodia could engineer non-alignment not only in diplomacy, but in concrete and in the rhythms of daily work. So these 4 factories and my argument contrast strongly with the legacy of American aid in Cambodia, where the United States imposed direct administration, leaving itself fully accountable for the highway failures. China offered aid with no strings attached, leaving planning and responsibility in Cambodian hands. Chinese technicians trained Cambodians, but Cambodian ministries controlled administration, screened staff, and integrated factories into state enterprises. Most uniquely, they made a concerted effort when screening applications for workers in these factories to ensure that any workers with communist sympathies were excluded. Cambodian actors were very concerned about these factories becoming cells of Chinese communist sympathies, and therefore exerted their influence over them to ensure that they maintained firmly within the sovereign goals of the 𝐶𝐿 government. This argument pushes back on the growing literature about global Maoism, which tends to frame China's engagement with third world countries during the Cold War as primarily ideological and driven by revolutionary fervor. In the Cambodian case, the desirability of Chinese industrial aid lay instead in China's similar starting point of industrial development and in the malleability of the Chinese aid administration, which allowed Cambodian state planners to integrate factories and hybridize their production into these national systems. Lastly, my final case study focuses on hydroelectric development. Here are 3 key dams, 𝐀𝐿𝐿, 𝐾𝐿, and 𝐻𝐿 Norodom, illustrate how Cambodia sought to electrify its economy while balancing Cold War pressures. Each was funded by a different partner, 𝐀𝐿𝐿 by Yugoslavia, 𝐾𝐿 by the Soviet Union, and 𝐻𝐿 Norodom by a US-led coalition. Together, they showed how Cambodia leveraged competing blocs to pursue sovereignty while resisting absorption into either camp. So again, to begin with a bit of context for this case study, Cambodia's independence in 1953 coincided exactly with US-led efforts to transform the Mekong River Basin into a Cold War showcase. Through the UN's Economic Commission for Asia and the Far East, And with the establishment of the 𝐀𝐿 Committee in 1957, American planners advanced a vision of large-scale dams that would rival the Soviet High Aswan Dam in Egypt, and in their words, harness the Mekong for peace. The US Bureau of Reclamation surveyed sites like Sambor and Stung Treng in Cambodia, envisioning enormous hydroelectric projects that would generate headlines as well as electricity. But these proposals did not match Cambodian planning priorities. Prince Sihanouk and the Ministry of Public Works judged them as impractical. Mega dams hundreds of kilometers from Phnom Penh would take decades to complete, demand capital far beyond Cambodia's means, and sit specifically in areas vulnerable to political conflict. What Cambodia wanted was not a showpiece, but a modest tributary project close to its industrial centers at Phnom Penh and increasingly at Sihanouk Belt, where power could be immediately tied to factories, irrigation, and urban electrification. This mismatch revealed something important. The Mekong project was less about Cambodian development than about US geopolitical theater, a stage for proving the superiority of American aid in Asia's Cold War battleground. Cambodian officials recognized this and pushed back by framing their own development needs in terms of sovereignty and pragmatism. By declining the lure of spectacular megadams, they preserved space to seek partners willing to fund smaller, more immediately useful projects. As the grand US-led Mekong plan stalled, Cambodia sought partners who would support projects aligned with its own development goals. As a result, 𝐀𝐿, Cambodia's first completed hydroelectric dam, modest in scale at just 10 megawatts, which is roughly enough to power about 8,000 homes at the time, nonetheless marked a technical and political milestone. Building the dam meant years of hydrological surveys, mountain engineering, and the difficult task of hauling turbines up eroded roads in the Cardamom foothills. But the real accomplishment behind this was diplomatic. At the first non-aligned summit in Belgrade in 1961, Prince Sihanouk forged a personal relationship with Josip Tito of Yugoslavia. Their meeting led directly to an aid agreement with the centerpiece being 𝐀𝐿. The Yugoslav firm Energo Project was given charge of the design and construction, making Cambodia one of the very few states in the world to receive hydroelectric aid from a non-aligned nation, rather than either bloc of the Cold War. By 1968, 𝐀𝐿 was supplying power to Phnom Penh. For Sihanouk, every watt carried symbolic weight and celebrated proof that Cambodia could maneuver independently through these Cold War rivalries. Next, 𝐀𝐿 was envisioned on a much, much larger scale than 𝐀𝐿, planned at 65 megawatts. However, Cambodian officials soon became skeptical of Soviet planning. The river itself, where it was planned, proved capricious. Torrents of water in the wet season, but near no water at all during the dry season, meant that the production would collapse just when it was needed most. As costs continued to develop, Cambodian planners began to push back. In 1966, Director of Hydraulics and Energy, 𝐀𝐿 Lem, convened a technical commission to reassess the project. His report was blunt. Cambodia should pause construction, renegotiate the Soviet loan, and even consider turning to other foreign firms if the Soviets were unwilling to adapt their approach. This extraordinary assertion of Cambodian agency, despite Moscow providing the financing and expertise, showed that Phnom Penh was refusing to be locked into a project that was too big, too costly, and above all, poorly suited for their national plans of development. 𝐀𝐿 never was completed and never produced power, but its significance lies precisely in this resistance. It showed that Cambodia would not passively accept Soviet aid if the project did not match its domestic development goals. Lastly, we have Prek Tanout. Prek Tanout was, above all, an effort to bring Cambodia back into the framework of the 𝐀𝐿 Committee. For American officials, Cambodian participation was essential. Without it, the committee risked looking like a front for US influence in Laos, Thailand, and South Vietnam. Yet Cambodia had formally terminated all aid with the US in 1963, so Washington could not act directly. Instead, the United States worked through its allies. Japan and Australia were pressed to take the lead, and additional support cobbled together from West Germany, Israel, and even Pakistan provided the funding. Yet this patchwork structure created its own problems. Each new partner required separate negotiations, feasibility studies, and political assurances. The very process of corralling half a dozen nations into a single project created delays. And as a result, construction did not begin until 1969. By then, however, as we all know, the political ground was already shifting. Within months of the groundbreaking, Sihanouk was deposed, civil war consumed the countryside, and the Khmer Rouge forces attacked the dam site directly. All engineers withdrew immediately, leaving behind unfinished embankments and half-installed machinery. So to conclude my core historical argument here, I want to return to the central concept of engineering non-alignment. First, engineering non-alignment was practiced within individual projects. We saw this in the 𝐀𝐛𝐬𝐭 hydroelectric scheme, where Cambodian officials resisted Soviet designs, and also in Prek Tanout, where Cambodian ministries pushed back against the US-led vision of the Mekong TVA-style dam structure. We also saw this perhaps most clearly in the factories funded by China, where Cambodian leaders negotiated for training and machinery, but resisted Chinese efforts to embed political propaganda or excessive managerial oversight. Second, and perhaps most importantly, engineering non-alignment was practiced between these projects by coordinating and amalgamating diverse forms of aid. The Sihanouk government stitched together highways from the United States, factories from China, and dams from Yugoslavia, and combined them all within an inherited colonial rail and river system. In practice, this meant that Chinese-funded cement traveled on US-funded roads and built homes in Phnom Penh that were powered by a Yugoslavian dam. So when we speak of engineering non-alignment, we are talking about more than diplomatic neutrality. We're talking about the technical and administrative work of balancing, resisting, and recombining foreign aid in ways that allowed Cambodia to build the material foundations of its independence. Before I conclude, I want to offer a few brief notes. This is not meant to be a finalized argument. This is still an area of the dissertation that I'm actively working on, but I want to suggest how a deeper understanding of this Sihanouk period of infrastructural development can shape the way we see Cambodia's contemporary infrastructure development over the last 3 decades. My larger point here is that this historical understanding really complicates a lot of popular narratives that I think dominate academic conversations about contemporary Cambodian infrastructure. We'll start with hydroelectricity, actually going in reverse orders, because I think this one provides us the clearest indication of this continuity. So in 1993, once Cambodia had emerged from decades of war with no functioning dams, it began again the search for hydroelectric power, but this time it did not start from scratch. However, the international landscape had changed dramatically. The World Bank imposed a moratorium on these large dams in the 1990s, and US aid was largely closed to Cambodia for political reasons. Cambodian ministries sought support from Western partners who conducted feasibility studies at sites like 𝐀𝐻𝐿, 𝐾𝐴𝐚, and Prek Tanout, but these efforts produced reports without financing. They began where efforts began in the early 1960s at 𝐾𝐴𝐿. The Austrian company Danube Hydro Austria was asked to conduct feasibility studies for the reconstruction of the dam. The resulting report was actually incredibly enthusiastic, saying that it would be an ideal project for Cambodia to begin regenerating electricity and even provide ideal opportunities for tourism. However, after the report was created, no funding materialized from Austria or any other Western partners. The exact same process played out in 𝐾𝐻𝐬, where the Canadian International Development Agency conducted a feasibility study. But because of environmental concerns domestically in Canada, the positive feasibility study was never followed up with funding or with actual plans for construction. And lastly, in Prek Tanout, both the Australian Catholic Relief Fund, which were involved in the initial construction, and the Japanese engineers themselves who were involved, returned to conduct a feasibility study, again suggesting that the dam would be an excellent site for reconstruction, and yet no funding or technical assistance materialized. Suddenly, in 2000, China stepped into this vacuum. The China Electricity Power Technology Import and Export Corporation, I'm sure it sounds much better in Chinese, agreed to rebuild 𝐾𝐴𝐿 in 1999. And by 2002, the construction was complete. This pattern again played out in 𝐾𝐴𝐚. Sino-Hydro began construction in 𝐾𝐴𝐚 in 2007, again financed by the Chinese Exim Bank, and it was completed in 2011. So the same project that was identified and developed by Cambodian planners in the 60s finally materialized in 2012 under Chinese technological aid. Prek Tanout itself was never completed. At this point, a more significant population in the area made displacement too large of a cost. However, it was still constructed to provide smaller dams that are used for irrigation, and this work was all provided by the Guangdong Foreign Construction Company. So I want to turn quickly to this chart. I think if you look just without historical context at the landscape of Cambodia's current hydropower, it seems very obvious that it is dominated by Chinese investment and perhaps even by Chinese planning. But what's really striking is that all the dams you see here that have been developed under the auspices of China's Belt and Road Initiative were actually planned in 1967 by the Cambodian Ministry of Public Works. Nearly every single dam that has been finished by Chinese technological aid was actually established during the Cold War in this pursuit of non-alignment. And I argue that after 1993, the Cambodian government actually attempted to take this same approach, seeking aid from multiple partners. However, without that aid actually materializing, they were left with only one alternative. In manufacturing, we see a similar legacy. I don't think I need to spend too much time talking about how important Chinese aid is in Cambodian textile manufacturing. There are over, I think, 1,200 Chinese invested factories in the country, worth a total investment of around 9 billion. But one of the most striking examples is that the 𝐀𝐻𝐿 cement factory was actually itself rebuilt with Chinese financing between 2012 and 2014. My goal here is not to suggest, an exact correlation between historical precedent and contemporary development, but a very clear path dependency that I think shapes the way we see the last few decades of development. And lastly, going back to the highway, the Chinese-built Phnom Penh-Sihanoukville Expressway has essentially replaced National Highway 4. For any of those of you who have taken both highways, it cut down travel time from about 5 hours on National Highway 4 to roughly 2. And again, I want to argue that the exact same sort of geospatial and economic priorities that animated the Sihanouk government were the main driver for projects like this expressway. Another example of this geographical reorientation that I want to end with today is the Funan Techo Canal. From independent to the present, as we've seen, leaders have consistently sought infrastructure that connects Cambodia directly to international markets and reduces reliance on neighboring countries. The Funan Techo Canal embodies the same goal. Planned as the 180-kilometer inland route linking Phnom Penh to the sea, this project is estimated at 1.7 billion. While the exact funding structure has changed and remains unclear, the China Bridge and Road Corporation will take a leading technical role. What makes this canal especially striking is the language surrounding it. Prime Minister Hun Manet described the project as allowing Cambodia to breathe through its own nose, the exact same phrase used by Sihanouk in the 1950s to describe the Khmer-American Friendship Highway. Then as now, the phrase captured the importance of building infrastructure that frees Cambodia from reliance on foreign transit. The continuity is clear. Just as the Khmer-American Highway and today's Chinese-built expressway both served the enduring priority of linking Phnom Penh and Sihanoukville, the Techo Canal combines the same logic, building direct sovereign routes to the sea. The only thing that shifted here is not the priorities or the strategic logic of these projects, but the partner who's supplying the technical aid. In Sihanouk's era, it was the United States, and today China's technical expertise and financial resources make this project possible. But as I argue, the underlying priority to breathe through Cambodia's own nose remains unchanged. Thank you very much for your engagement with this talk, and I look forward to any questions.
Wow, well, thank you, Taylor. This is a really impressive talk you just delivered. It was rich and ambitious tour of Cambodia's mid-century state building, and it did what the best history does. It changed how we think about something we thought we knew. 3 threads stood out for me before we get into questions. First, the materiality of non-alignment. You asked us to see neutrality not only in communiques and conferences, but in the concrete and steel of roads, dams, and factories. And the picture that emerges is not Cambodia toggling between blocks, but Cambodian planners assembling a national system from rival parts. I mean, I love that slide with, the concrete, the road built by the US, the electricity provided by the Yugoslav, the concrete by the Chinese. The concept of, quote, engineering non-alignment, unquote, lands with force here. It reframes agency at the level of procurement rules, oversight routines, and training pipelines, not just at the level of high politics. Second, I would note that contingency and constraint. Your account of the Khmer-American Friendship Highway is a case study in how technical choices reshape diplomacy. Aggregates, drainage, and machinery sound like footnotes until the rainy season exposes them as first-order political variables. By the way, the same complaints that I heard you share about the Khmer-American Friendship Road, I would hear about Chinese-built roads. They didn't study what the soil was like, and it, stopped functioning and was gone by the time the rainy season came. So it really is the case that while history doesn't repeat itself, it often rhymes. When the laterite base failed, so did the set of claims about the model of aid tied to private contracting and arm's length supervision. By contrast, your factories chapter shows Chinese aid with a lighter administrative footprint that Cambodian ministries could bend towards their own planning logics, even when output disappointed. The comparison is provocative because it suggests that where responsibility sits in the aid apparatus can matter as much as the financing itself. And finally, third, method. You move deftly between archives in Cambodia, Australia, and the US, and then ground truth the paper trail with site visits. That triangulation lets you trace not only intent and design, but weather, soil, labor as historical actors. It's rare to see technopolitics treated with such level of empirical texture. Again, congratulations, Taylor. Now, I've asked for questions to be shared, and a couple have come in from Wai-Hing Wong and Visnava. But I'll take the moderator's privilege and ask you the first question, which is, in terms of conceptual framing, if one is reversing the lens, you frame Cambodia as not merely a recipient of aid, but an active agent shaping geopolitical outcomes through infrastructure. Can you elaborate on how that reframing challenges traditional narratives of Cold War development?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question and for your kind remarks in general. I think that's incredibly helpful for me as I think through this. In terms of the conventional narratives about Cold War aid, I think the lens of technopolitics is typically applied to the donor nations to look at how their own sort of political priorities were embedded in these projects, right? So as I showed in the case of the highway, for example, trying to really showcase the model of capitalist development by training Cambodian ministries on how to manage private contractors, right? So there's a lot of work on this sort of intentional intertwining or embedding of technological artifacts and then the political values or ideals that produce them, right? What I try to do here is actually look at the antithesis of this, which is the effort on the part of recipient nations, in this case, Cambodia, of actually extricating these two things. Of screening, the workers that are going to be entering the factories from communist sympathies, of integrating new forms of management, for example, the American forms of management into Chinese factories, to try as much as they can to strip away the sort of political embeddedness of these technological projects to make them fit within their own, right? So this is something that was very much, an aspect that American and Chinese donors were very much aware of. In the American case, they referred to it as aid mixing, and it was something that they sought very strongly to resist in Cambodia. But nevertheless, I think my studies show that Cambodia's actors were very capable of disentangling the politics from the artifacts and trying as much as possible to get the latter without the former. So, what I really want to suggest here is that it works both ways, in the same way that, technological artifacts can be intentionally imbued with political significance. That political significance can be stripped away and changed, by the receiving nation. And that's what I really want to focus on in this argument.
Fabulous. Thank you for that answer. There are a few questions already in the Q&A. I'm just going to try to allow as many as possible to come through that way, since we want things to be as participatory as possible.
Yep.
The first one is actually from somebody who is not currently any longer among the participants, because I was looking to unmute this individual's microphone, but we'll just pose it just because I think it's a good question. It's from Kenny Wong who says, "Thank you very much for your excellent presentation. You argued that the Prak Dam was largely a project that the United States encouraged its allies to pursue after Cambodia ceased its cooperation with Washington. To what extent do you think countries such as Japan and Israel were acting independently in this context, or might their involvement reflect a vision of regional order distinct from that of the United States?"
Yeah, this is an excellent question, and I'll actually focus specifically on Japan here because they were the primary planner and the primary actual funder of the Prak project. So there's actually a great paper that exists now that focuses on Prak from the Japanese perspective, actually looking at the long history of Japanese colonial influence in Southeast Asia during World War II to draw continuity with their work on hydrological projects like Prak. So I don't want to completely, dismiss or undermine Japanese political agency in this project. However, one of the things that I found most striking in my archival work was how much, in their own words, arm twisting American diplomats did to essentially force Japanese engineers and Japanese diplomats into the Prak project. It was a source of a lot of diplomatic work, several trips to Tokyo, and internal documents reveal that without strong American pressure, Israel, Japan, Australia would have never been involved in the Prak project. So from the American diplomatic records, it's clear that this coalition was very much stitched together intentionally to substitute for the fact that because of the breakdown in relations, America could no longer be directly involved in this. And another feature of it is that as the Vietnam War intensified, Congress passed a law that any aid in Cambodia had to be justified on military terms. So this makes it clear that projects like Prak, if they were primarily funded and sponsored by the US, would also not be politically viable in Cambodia because they would have to say explicitly that America is doing this for military aims, right? So as a result, they worked very hard to ensure that Japan and Australia took the financial and technical lead, but this was only true after significant coercion by American politicians.
Wow, interesting. When you talk about Japan being kind of a arm twisted into doing these things, it sounds somehow very familiar even now, as we observe geopolitics unfolding. Well, it's a pretty straightforward question. I'm just gonna pose Elise's question for you. What led you to seek information at the 3 particular archives that you chose?
This is an excellent question. Thank you for this. You'll notice from my case studies that Chinese archives are missing here, and that's largely a practical feature of difficulty of access, especially for politically sensitive topics like this. Despite the fact that Chinese is one of my research languages, it is very difficult to get access to a lot of these archives in China itself. However, what I found, fortunately, through this approach is that a lot of the bilateral documents between Cambodia and China that would be difficult to access in China are freely available here in the Cambodian National Archives. So I was even able to find copies of Chinese language documents from Chinese Foreign Ministry about these aid projects in Cambodia's National Archive itself. In terms of the choice of the US archive, not only US aid projects, but luckily the paranoia of American officials during the Cold War meant that they paid very, very close attention to the Soviet and Chinese projects themselves. So a lot of my technical detailing of these projects come from US sources. The Australian one is actually the most interesting. I'm not sure if I mentioned this at the time, but from 1965, when relations formally ended, 1963 is when American aid was terminated, but relations formally broke down in 1965 until 1970, when Lon Nol took over and had close relations with the US. There was no diplomatic exchange whatsoever directly between the US and between Cambodia. As a result, Australia played this sort of subtle intermediary role where all diplomatic communications and cables went through their embassy. So when I visited the Australian National Archives, I was very happy to find that essentially those 5 years that were a blank slate for me were filled by the archival records there. One other thing to mention is that in addition to Japanese technical leadership and funding for Prak, Australia actually provided the main construction ability through their Snowy Mountain Hydro Corporation. So Snowy Mountain Hydro is the largest hydroelectric project in Australia itself, provides a lot of power to Sydney and to the eastern parts of Australia. And their institutional archives are held in the National Archives of Australia as well, which are very valuable for those technical skills. So there are other archives, I think, that could be useful to enrich this program. The Serbian archives actually would be very valuable to provide more insight into Yugoslavian, participation in projects like Curie Rome. But these three, I think, provided the strongest foundation for the project.
Wow. No, that makes a lot of sense now. Why Australia, for example? I did wonder about
Yeah.
that. I will note, and it's more related to the earlier question about well, the comment that was made about road construction, that the most recent expressway build that is from Phnom Penh to Sihanoukville, the complaints seem to be that it's very expensive. The toll is very high. It's $15.20 just about for a car, $30 for a small truck, and $75 for a 20-ton truck. So it's definitely at a much higher level of cost. And so part of all of this, of course, is it's got to be sustainable from the profitable from the standpoint of the builder. But it's oftentimes done in a build, operate, transfer fashion, which is they make money and then, oh, here the equipment, the road is now yours, but we've had it for 20 years now, making money off of it, and by then it'll be in much worse shape, I'm sure. Visna is not able to unmute for some reason. I will simply choose a question from the set of 4 that he has posed. I'll just do the third one. Cold War sentiment still remains in today's world context. Should Cambodia continue non-alignment principles in its foreign policy for better national development?
That's a great question. I think there's a lot of really interesting work about sort of new non-alignment, contemporary non-alignment, that argues that for smaller, medium-sized states like Cambodia, this strategy is still probably the only politically viable one, as sort of great power competition, rears its ugly head again. And I agree with this sentiment at the level of diplomacy, and I think we've actually seen this play out very recently. After decades of relatively poor relations with the U.S. and close relations with China, I think the recent border conflict with Thailand showed how quickly Cambodia is able to sort of, turn back to strong relations with the U.S. when it serves its domestic political goals, right? I think we've seen this outpouring of support for Donald Trump's intervention on the Cambodian side, which was, I think, surprising to a lot of observers who look at things like this, but in some ways I found it kind of vindicating to hear these echoes of non-alignment still resonate in contemporary Cambodian statecraft. So I think at the level of diplomacy for countries in ASEAN, that this non-aligned strategy is still really essential to balance, autonomy while still gaining the development benefits that China can provide. However, in terms of infrastructure, I think the outlook is a little bit less promising, just because unfortunately, we don't still live in this world where we have multiple competing powers who are not only offering political and diplomatic support, but also technical and funding support for infrastructure, right? So what I argue is that after 93 in the early 2000s too, Cambodia really did attempt to pursue this again. They almost dusted off the old playbook of non-alignment, went out seeking lots of partners who were willing to do studies, to offer, rhetorical support for these projects, but then funding never materialized. So I fear that in terms of infrastructure development, the ability to pursue this non-aligned strategy is really constrained by a lack of viable alternatives, and that actors like China seem to be one of the only ones able to provide this infrastructure at a cost and in a way that is appealing to governments like Cambodia.
Right, and obviously always without strings attached, but with invisible strings attached.
That's right. That's right.
I'll move on to Caroline's question, and then unless there are more questions, I'll go back to Visna. Another one of Visna's questions that I think is interesting. But Caroline says, such a thoughtful and well-researched presentation and an equally brilliant. Please stop it. My question as a budding researcher: what were some of your most valuable or unexpected primary, secondary resources as you were doing your research for this project?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. One of the things that I really found most surprising in this was the level of archival detail that I found both in the Cambodian and American archives about the Chinese-funded factories. And the fact that despite the level of resources available, there is, to my knowledge, nothing really published about these projects at all. So I didn't bore you in this talk with the technical detail I have, but I mean, even down to the price per square meter of the plywood and the different grades that were provided, the aggregates of cement that were used, the different types of cements produced in these factories, all of this is recorded very clearly in historical record. And I found that very shocking how much of a historical precedent there is for the current role of China's investment in Cambodian manufacturing, despite the fact that this is almost never discussed. We treat Chinese investment in Cambodian manufacturing as a purely new phenomena, I think, most of the time. It gets kind of wrapped into this literature on the Belt and Road Initiative, which I think kind of obscures more than it reveals in some ways by lumping this all under, Chinese grand strategy without seeing the historical domestic priorities of Cambodia that really do shape these projects in meaningful ways. So I was delightfully surprised to find that much, technical detail about these projects.
Fabulous. We'll go back to one of Vesna's questions that I didn't get to pose that I think is interesting. From your study, how do you assess Cambodia's statecraft ability during the Cold War period, if compared with her neighbors?
Yeah, I think I am actually relatively optimistic and positive in a lot of ways about Cambodian statecraft. I think one thing I try to do as a historian is to resist this hindsight. We understand in 1970, suddenly the center could no longer hold, things fell apart. This attempt to, pursue non-alignment suddenly collapsed. But if we, really take things as they were from independence until that, I think you actually see a lot of success in this strategy. I mean, you see incredibly rapid progress in economic development. You see a lot of attention from donor nations that were not, simultaneously focusing on other countries. For example, the fact that Cambodia was not only able to attract investment and even, technical assistance from the two competing sides of the Cold War, but also the non-aligned movement itself. Cambodia was one of the only countries to receive investment from, Yugoslavia in the same way. So I think for a period, especially in terms of infrastructure, it was incredibly successful. One of the risks of this that I don't talk about much here is that this non-aligned, infrastructure approach also meant that the ministries working more closely with, say, US or US aligned projects and those working more closely with Soviet or Chinese projects began to subtly sort of have political allegiances that I think resulted in some tension domestically in the Cambodian government itself. You find records of ministers who were working closely with Americans, kind of passing information in a very clandestine way about competing projects and vice versa. So I think the difficulty is that while the government as a whole pursued this non-aligned policy, what happened practically because of the way that they delegated and worked with donor nations meant that it provided some tension domestically in Cambodia itself too, that I think resulted in the outbreak of civil war.
Fascinating. We've got a new question that came in from Ann Hansen. I won't do the unmuting thing since we've had so much trouble with it. I'll just read it out. I was intrigued by your discussion of the symbolic value for nation building of the Chinese-built factories. Could you elaborate more about the symbolic importance? That's one question. Were they important because they were built with foreign aid? Question number two, or because they were introducing new technologies? And finally, were there local non-aid built companies that were equally important to nation building?
This is an excellent question. So I think in terms of their symbolic importance, one thing I should have spent a little bit more time talking about were the actual names of these factories. So for example, I referred to the plywood factory based on its location in my talk. But if you actually look at the very brief part of the video at the beginning, it's actually called the Sihanouk Zhou Friendship Factory. So there's nothing mentioned at all about plywood actually in the title of it. What it's producing here is actually sort of diplomatic friendship and relationship as strongly as it is plywood. So a lot of the rhetoric, the opening ceremonies, the media around this really positioned them as being symbols of a growing diplomatic relationship between Cambodia and China. At the same time, however, unlike highways, which had a precedent, there were already roads in Cambodia. These factories were really introducing something really novel. Under the French protectorate, there was almost no industrialization aside from small, handicraft, large, small scale projects like this. So the introduction of these grand factories, especially like the concrete factory, really demonstrated, just visually this aspiration for Cambodia to break away from this sort of colonial system of extraction where raw resources like rice and rubber were exported and began to actually like innovate with these projects and produce higher value added products through industrialization. So For visitors who saw this, I think, the importance of it was very evident. This is something that was unprecedented in Cambodia and was rhetorically, designed to show that they were a product of Chinese-Cambodian friendship. And this is true throughout all of the factories, that their titles speak more to the diplomatic relationships that produce them than the actual physical products they produce themselves.
Uh, I think that the title of that factory being 𝐀𝐛𝐬𝐭 Sihanouk is very telling. It's all personalization, and you'd think it's China, Cambodia, something or another friendship, but it's literally the names of the individuals, and that says a lot about how politics was conducted. We've got another question from a dear old friend, Sarah Kitt, who congratulates you on your great research and on becoming I think she wants to say, a doctoral candidate. What are your next steps beyond your doctoral work?
This is the hardest question, I think, for any PhD candidate, as we all know. So I love doing research, and I very much enjoyed this project, but my real passion actually lies in teaching. That's something that I've been doing professionally for years now, even before I began the PhD project. So I do have a plan to apply for some academic jobs in the US, just to see if my research is appealing to departments, if it fits what people are looking for. But honestly, my plan is also to come back to Cambodia potentially long term. I really enjoy living and working here. And when I was here for my extended dissertation work, I had the opportunity to work with a lot of PhD students at RUPP and several other institutions here, and was really shocked to see the genuinely incredible quality of their work. It really pushed me, honestly, to improve my own and enriched it significantly. So in some ways, I would really like my work to support these scholars. I'm not sure what we need is, more Americans like myself telling the story of Cambodia. I would really like my work and my passion for teaching to help, support and to help build a new generation of Cambodian researchers themselves. So depending on how things work out, I'm actually really looking forward to, after graduating in May, coming back to Cambodia for a much longer period and hopefully apply my teaching skills here.
Well, that would be a fantastic answer to a concluding job talk right there. So I know we've posed so many questions for you. I mean, obviously, one could think of many more possibilities. In fact, yes, no, nothing you came in into by way of question. But I think I'll on that note about what's next, which is always, the eternal question of you're never done, because even when you graduate, there's more that's expected of you. But that's the one day that you're actually done for that day. I'll close us out with just a few parting thoughts here. First of all, I want to thank you, Taylor, for sharing such a rich and thought-provoking presentation, and thanks as well to everyone who asked questions and joined the discussion. What today's session made clear is that infrastructure is not just bricks, steel, and concrete. It's also diplomacy, ideology, national ambition made tangible. Taylor showed us how Cambodia's pursuit of non-alignment was not confined to conference halls and communiques, but was engineered into roads, factories, and dams that were supposed to give the country the ability, in Prince Sihanouk's phrase, to breathe through its own nose. We saw the paradox. Projects designed to guarantee sovereignty were built with foreign aid, and sometimes the very materials like laterite for the Friendship Highway undermined both the road itself and the diplomatic scaffolding around it. Yet we also saw moments where Cambodian ministries asserted agency, integrating Chinese, French, and even Japanese inputs into factories that were as much symbols of independence as sites of production. The questions we discussed underscored that sovereignty is rarely absolute. It is managed, contested, and occasionally compromised in the design of a drainage system, in the siting of a factory, and in the training of technicians. That Taylor could bring this level of empirical detail to such big conceptual stakes is what makes this project so compelling. For those of us thinking about Cambodia today, the echoes are unmistakable. The dilemmas of balancing foreign powers, of turning external aid into domestic capacity, and of building for both economic growth and political survival are not just Cold War history, they remain live issues. On behalf of the Center for Khmer Studies, I want to thank Taylor once more for sharing this important work, and thank you all for joining from across time zones, maybe even across the world. Please keep an eye out for future events in our Research Fellow series. And with that, we'll formally close this session. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all sincerely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.